My name is Eric Romo. I'm the founder and CEO of a company called AltspaceVR. We're a social VR company. I'll explain what that means as part of the talk. And then I'll drill down into one concept that's pretty important in social VR, which is the concept of avatars and digital representations of self and how we represent ourselves and what that means. But I really wanted to start with just talking a little bit about social VR and what it is, because I think in a venue like this, social is a word that's used probably by a lot of these companies to mean a lot of different things. I think some people hear social VR and they think my Facebook feed is flying at me in 3D. Tweets are coming out of the air and are little birds, and that's actually not at all what we mean by social VR. So the way I think we think about what social VR is and how we lay it out is sort of on this landscape. And so if you think about communication spectrum from starting with a text message on one end, a very ephemeral, only text-based, very nonverbal communication, and on the other end is actually physically being in the same room together. Is being here to interact one-on-one in person. And you think about that spectrum and you think about the difference between those forms of communication. And as you think about the spectrum, you kind of move from one side to the other and you add interactivity, you add emotional depth to communication. You add an ability to do more things together and really feel as if you're there together. As we move from left to right, you start adding, maybe a social media post where I can see pictures about you rather than just text about you. I go and I'm adding going to a phone call where I can hear your voice and I hear your tone of voice, and so that tells me something about your emotions and how you're feeling. I move to a video chat, and now I'm sort of seeing facial expressions and sort of get a sense for where you are and more about your appearance. But if you think about the difference between a video chat, which I think we would all agree is sort of the best form of electronic communication that we have available to us today, and you think about the gap between a video chat and actually being in the same room together, it's massive. I mean, it's why people fly for tens of hours to be at conferences like this, in the case of some of the organizers. It's why we choose to drive to go to meetings rather than being on video chat. If you think about your communication life and how often, as you're choosing one of these mediums, when you want to communicate with your friends or your family, you're choosing actually to go be physically present with them, and think about why you're making that choice. It's because video chat, as compared to being in the same room, is actually quite lacking. And this is really the opportunity for what we call social VR, is to define a new communications medium, a new way for us to communicate in real time that has some of the things that you have when you're together that other electronic communications media don't. And so when we think about social VR really is fundamentally a new way for us to communicate. This is a new medium for us to use. And so when we think about what we do is more on a vein with Skype or Google Hangouts or WhatsApp or other ways that we communicate than it is with social media, for example. And so they're kind of two fundamental ways that communicating in VR, being as an avatar in a virtual environment with the headset on and looking around and seeing other people, is different than other electronic communication. Those two fundamental ways. One is what we talk about as nonverbal communication. So this is a group of things we'll talk about more in a second. And the second thing is what can we do together, the context of communication. So let me elaborate a little bit on those two things. So by nonverbal communication, what we mean are things like eye contact, right? The ability to engage someone in conversation this way. Like body language, being able to gesture at stuff and point at things, right? Personal space is a really big thing in body language, right? The distance between us signifies something, and if we change that distance, that also says something about our relationship. The direction of my voice. Now, my voice is coming from these speakers, but if one of you spoke, I would hear you, and I would know to look at you because you spoke. These cues, these nonverbal cues, if you think about it, are completely lost in electronic communication. They basically don't exist. And in phone calls and in video chat, this is why being in a video chat or phone call feels less natural than being in the same room, because in the same room we have all of these cues. In VR, we have most of these. They start to come back. The ability to feel physically present with other people, the ability to see body language represented on an avatar, the ability to feel close or far from someone, and how that makes you emotionally connected. The one thing we don't have yet, of course, in VR is facial expressions. There's lots of great companies, smarter people than me that are working on that. But this is something that people point to and they say, well, in video chat, I have facial expressions. So, of course, that's a really powerful thing. And it is when you happen to know that person very well, but as often as not, if we don't know each other very well, the facial expressions are actually less valuable in communication. And we'll have them eventually in VR. And so these nonverbal communication cues that you have back in VR that you don't have in video chat amount to a feeling that we're actually in the same place together, which, again, if you think about a video chat experience or a phone call experience, you almost never, I think probably never for most of us, would leave that communication experience and say, gosh, it felt like we were in the same room. You would basically never say that. And I think in some Cisco telepresence sales pitches, maybe they say that. But most of the time, you don't feel that way. All right? But in VR, and this is one of these things that I get to say that you guys won't believe unless you try it, you feel as if you're there with someone. When there's someone 6,000 miles away in Japan and they bow at you after your conversation, you feel like that person's right there. And this connection of people is a big fundamental difference of the way that we can communicate in VR electronically than how we communicate in the media we have available to us today. So that second thing that's really different about VR, the second thing we can do in VR that we can't do in video chat and phone calls and text messages is what we just shorthand call the context of communication. So what this means is the things that we can do together. Okay, so if you think about your communication life when you get together with people in the real world, you tend to have something that is the focal point of your communication experience that you're doing. You are hanging out with a friend and watching a sporting event. You're going to a group of friends' house and you're playing a card game. You're in the kitchen with a bunch of people and you're cooking while you're talking. You go to the movies and you talk about the movie afterward. You go for a walk in the park. You, in a professional setting, draw on a whiteboard or look at slides. There's typically something, some form of media often, some interactable object often, that you're communicating around in the real world. And most of the time in video chat and in phone calls, you can't do those things. You can't go for a walk on a phone call. I guess one of you could, but you're not doing it together. You can't play a card game. No one plays cards over Skype. It's very hard to watch content together over video chat or audio chat. So the ability for us to participate in an experience together, to share something together on electronic communication is very, very limited, if not non-existent. Now, some games are the counterexample to that, right? We can talk while we play games, audio chat while we play games. But most of the time, if you think about the way you communicate electronically, you're not doing something together with other people. VR gives us this ability to interact with things, to interact with the world while we're with someone. And so this gives us a breadth of context, a breadth of things that we can do together that don't exist in other electronic communications. And so this, along with nonverbal communication, are the two fundamental things that make VR, social VR, a thing, that make it what we think is going to be some on the menu of choices that you'll have in a few years. When you're thinking about how do you communicate with your friends or family or loved ones that are distant, you're going to say, do I send them a text message? Do I write them a letter? Do I call them on the phone? Do I video chat? Or do I connect with them in VR? That's at least what gets us up every morning. And this is why we care. I know this is a games conference primarily, but we fundamentally see ourselves as a communications company. And so we care about this because there are more smartphones sold in a week than PlayStations and Xboxes sold in a year. We care about this because 30 times more people used Skype last month than used World of Warcraft in their best month. We care about this because communication is completely ubiquitous. Gaming, of course, is massive, and I don't mean to underplay that, but communication is something that absolutely every single one of us do. I would bet that 100% of this room has probably used text and phone and video chat within the last week. So communication is a huge opportunity, and we think that this is where VR could have a potential to really change the way people live. Of course, there's a great panel here just before this about entertainment in VR. That's going to be massive. Games in VR are going to be massive. But communication, we think, is potentially the defining trait of VR. When you think about a future where there's 1 billion people using virtual reality, I'm sure that a massive portion of that will be gamers. But if there's that many people, they're probably using it to communicate primarily. So I'm going to switch gears from what is social VR and talk a little bit about one of the kind of key things about social VR. It's probably one of the things that I think in my professional career, I think has this trait above everything else I've ever done, that are sort of preconceptions of what most people think when they think about this concept of avatars. Almost all completely uniform in what most people think when they kind of get into the space, and are almost all completely 180 degrees from where they'll end up if they start digging into the space, which is totally weird. But I find myself having sort of the same conversation over and over again about avatar theory and about what avatars are in social VR and why. And a lot of this, obviously avatars are a very, very important part of our nonverbal communication. They're how we're represented and in things like personal space and body language and head movement. That's how we represent those things are on an avatar. In a lot of things, I think we have preconceptions about avatars from games and from movies and from things that we've worked on in the past. And a lot of the people who work on those things, we have people from DreamWorks and big games companies that work at our company, come with lots of experience of avatars in those other mediums. And I think what we found is that the things you walk in the room with, thinking about what avatars should be based on those preconceptions, are often wrong. And what's interesting and why I say they're wrong is because there's actually a pretty large body of research about avatars in communication and the communication between people who are using avatars. Virtual Human Interaction Lab. It's amazing that actually exists, right? This is a thing that's been around for 15 years, and what they study is the communication theory, the psychology theory of people interacting as avatars in virtual place headsets on. When I found out 3 or 4 years ago that this was a thing, my jaw hit the floor. I couldn't imagine that there would be people doing research on this, but they have, and they've done tons of research about how people interact as avatars, and what they find is often counterintuitive to what we walk in the room with. What we walk in the room with is always, I want the avatar to be as detailed as possible. I want it to look as much like me as possible. I want it to be animated as much as possible. This is always what people invariably think about avatars. And the findings are actually often quite the opposite. So I thought what I'd maybe do is break down some of the top findings that you'll see in the literature from the VHIL and things that we've seen in building avatars for AltSpace. So the first thing, I think, that what they talk about is social presence. Okay, so this is this concept of, people talk about this word presence in VR, which essentially means, do I feel like I'm in that other place? And social presence is the concept of, do I feel like I am there with you? Right? Do I feel like we are there together? Do I feel like that avatar is a person that I'm interacting with? Okay. And so there's kind of 3 main things, I think, that come out of that research that are often counterintuitive. The first is things about the Uncanny Valley, which we've all, I'm sure, heard about before. We often hear about these things, but we don't necessarily internalize them. This is a fun chart. This is the mechano-humanness score. So how much does it look like a human as you move to the right? Okay. And likability. How much do I like interacting with an avatar that has that mechano-humanness score? And the Uncanny Valley is this dip, right? So it is, if it looks like a plane in space, I kind of am pretty indifferent to it. You start to give it some shape that makes it look sort of like maybe it's a person or thing, right? A roundness to the head, and I start to like it a little bit more. And then you give it some sort of very abstract eyes where eyes might be on that round thing as a head, and I like it a little more. And then it starts to look more and more like a person, but not quite yet like a person, and I like it less and less and less and less, to the point where it looks really pretty close to a person, and I actually hate it. And then all of a sudden it looks perfect and I love it again, okay? But there's this point where our enjoyment of interacting with that avatar starts to go down, and we actually don't want any more detail, which is the contrary of what most people say. Well, gosh, I just really want it to look exactly like my friend. And the reality of today's technology, and this is a really good example, and the digital representation of Arnold Schwarzenegger from the last Terminator movie is a really good example. The best technology that we have to either physically make avatars or digitally represent avatars, the best technology, if you give me a supercomputer and 16 hours per frame, I still can't make you feel right, like that's actually a person. And so what ends up when you try and make eye contact with that avatar that is the best in class that we have, it just feels weird. It just doesn't quite feel right. And this is the Uncanny Valley, where sometimes people theorize that the reason the Uncanny Valley exists is because avatars, representations that are not animated right, where the light is not reflecting off the skin right, starts to sort of look like a corpse. And so we have a negative reaction to that because the face is not twitching in the right way and the facial muscles are not moving in the right way. And so that's a theory that's out there, is that it looks sort of like a person, but it looks kind of like a dead person. And so I don't want to look at that. And so this is why the Uncanny Valley exists. And this is something that will tell you, hey, I don't really necessarily want all that detail. I don't necessarily want lots of structure in cheekbones. I don't necessarily want the skin tone to be close enough to human, but not quite like a human. And so it kind of guides you to, where do you want to be on, as we go back to this, where do you want to be on that spectrum? Because if you'll notice, the kind of enjoyment, likability peak, at least in these studies that they put together, is kind of way over to the left there, right? If I were to say plot what that means in relative abstractness, that would be a pretty abstract avatar. That peak might be a sphere with 2 dots where the eyes are, right? Which is not something people would expect, right? So is that sort of representation would be fulfilling and interesting. So the second thing that often comes up in this research is that tracking it tends to be more important than realism. So here's what I mean by that. Just tracking is, how do I measure what your actual physical body is doing and then represent that on an avatar? So tracking in VR, examples are, with the Gear VR, I have the rotation of my head, so I can represent rotation on an avatar's head. With the Oculus Rift or the HTC Vive, I have now rotation and position, so I can represent the position of my head in addition to rotation. With Vive or touch controllers, now I have the position and orientation of your hands, so I can represent position and orientation. With the Leap Motion, I can represent where all of your fingers and joints are. With mocap systems that exist, like the perception neuron from Noitom, I can now represent where some of your joints are in space. Okay, so this is tracking, is measuring an actual thing about your body, your physical body, and then representing that in an avatar. The example of tracking on the left is an experiment that we did with an eye tracking system from a company called SMI, where there's eye tracking sensors embedded in the headsets, and they are actually measuring the position of your eyes, where your eyes are looking. Not surprisingly, because a lot of the literature here tells us that tracking is more important than realism, we found a just massive improvement on social engagement when you had eyes. Now, our eyes tend to be pointed straight ahead, but it gives us a little more life when we can kind of look around a little bit and when we know, okay, I always forget one of them is I look up and to the left and I'm lying, or I look up and to the right and I'm lying. I can never remember which that is, but it gives us more life, that avatar, if we can track the eyes. And so on the right is an example of a representation of realism, right? This is a guy who's got lots of cool facial hair and smoking a cigarette, and his lips are the right color. But I guarantee that if you sat across from this person in a virtual space and tried to have a conversation with them, it would feel very, very strange. Okay, and so this is an example of super abstract but high degree of tracking versus something that is more realistic with no tracking and animation. And the literature tells us that tracking is much, much more important than the realism. And the last thing that I'll cover on the research of avatar research, and we'll have some time for questions, is this concept of don't show what you don't know. So this is a kind of a phrase that comes out of the research, which is saying the converse is show only what you know. Okay, so don't give detail about an avatar that you are not measuring, that you are not sure that is correct. So this is an example of an avatar that we introduced at AltspaceVR. And Thai Guy, as we referred to him after a while, was terrible. This was just an awful avatar to interact with. To have a conversation with someone wearing Thai Guy was a really bad experience. And the word that came up in every study and every piece of user feedback and internally over and over and over again was creepy. This was just a really creepy guy to have a conversation with. It just did not feel right. And so the answer, the question was, of course, why? Why is that this guy feels very creepy? Why is it that it's a very negative experience and he's not in the product anymore, luckily? And the answers are things like, look at his facial structure. So Thai Guy has divine cheekbones, right? And so when you talked as Thai Guy, your face would not actually animate the right way. So the skin over his cheekbones wouldn't move like our brains expect them to move. And so that was a little strange. We're showing cheekbones and the muscles over them, and we don't know how those muscles are moving. He has very well-defined lips, right? And we didn't use a very sophisticated lip motion algorithm, and so it was very weird that Thai Guy's lips were not moving even though you were talking. Thai Guy sort of has a color and shading that looks human, but not quite right enough, and so that was odd. You could see Thai Guy's pupils through his sunglasses, but his pupils didn't move and his eyes didn't blink, and so that looked strange. So it was extraneous detail that caused the experience to be negative that was put on Thai Guy. And so this would then lead us to the converse, which is that you should show only detail that you're actually tracking and only detail that you can actually represent correctly. And so you tend to see in some social VR, you tend to see very, very abstract avatars. And this is the crux of, and I'll close with the kind of hardest thing I think about avatars are, you look at some of our more recent avatars on the left, and they have some of the elements that maybe now are apparent why. They're very abstract. They don't have a lot of facial features. They are use shading and colors that are not realistic enough that they look strange. You look at those, and I think the reaction that a lot of people in the games industry, a lot of people in the computer graphics industry, a lot of consumers have is, wow, their animators must be terrible. It's the thing that people think of when they see that, right? It's very, very, very simple. The reality is that getting simple right in social VR is extremely hard, actually. And getting the right shape of the eye so it didn't feel weird that it wasn't exactly blinking right and that the pupils weren't moving. Hundreds of iterations. Getting the right shape of the face so it was okay that if the lips are not moving right, it didn't make the rest of the face look weird. It took tons of time. And so it's actually quite difficult to make something that feels fulfilling to interact with, and what feels fulfilling to interact with doesn't necessarily look compelling on a 2D page. And so this is probably one of the biggest challenges of social VR in general, of our company, is that we put out imagery that represents what is going to make you feel good. But yet that 2D imagery falls short of some of the amazing renderings that you see representing games. So I think that's close to my time, so I've got a little time for questions, right?
Yeah, hi. So this is going to be one of those annoying predict the future type questions. But you were talking about, the Uncanny Valley and so on and so forth, and I think, people working in the games industry think they're kind of getting close to cross it to reaching the far side of that. I mean, how long do you imagine it will be, or is it even desirable for us to be communicating with photorealistic, representations of our loved ones and so on in VR?
Yeah, I mean, so I tend to look to cues more than in games in the motion picture industry and say, what can we learn from the best of the best of the best of the state of the art? And I should show that clip from the whatever Terminator 17 or whatever it is.
And I've seen it.
Yeah, it's really obvious which one is real and which one isn't, right? And what would make it just absolutely more striking is if it was looking at you in the face and trying to have a conversation with you. And all your brain, so this is another thing I should have mentioned. Our brains are really good difference engines, so we're really good at noticing what's wrong. So this is sort of the salad in your teeth example. So you go to have a conversation with somebody who just had lunch and they've got a little piece of salad in their teeth. You just keep looking. You can't stop looking at it, right? I mean, this feeling? That's sort of what happens with avatars, right? So in talking to Arnold Schwarzenegger, who's been rendered in CG, all you're going to see is, gosh, it's just his face is not moving right in the right spot there, and your brain's going to be drawn to it. Whereas if you show no detail, your brain is not drawn to those negative things. But the challenge is that every single person instinctually wants photorealism. They want it to look exactly like me. And so I think what we'll do as an industry is we'll find the way to sort of navigate that uncanny valley and get you more of those things that you want without drawing out the negatives. But you asked me to hypothesize a while, I think, because if we can't do it, it was somebody at I think Lucasfilm that said to me, if we can't do it with a supercomputer in 16 hours per frame, how are we going to do it in real time on a smartphone? And that's a pretty big gap.
So for Vive and Rift Touch experiences, you just show the hands.
We do, yeah. So
Okay.
this is one of these things that again, like the visual experience is very different than the emotional experience. So our brains are really, really good at seeing a thing floating in the air and like waving and doing this and saying, oh, that's his hand, right? We're good at mapping objects onto ourselves. Like our body is a projection.
So I mean, in every session I've been to, like the subject of AR seems to come up like flow naturally from VR. And I do wonder because I'd imagine like these avatars, they kind of make more sense against a virtual background than they would do against a real backdrop. How does AR change the kind of work you're doing? Are you even thinking about that?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think we definitely think that there's a communication experience in AR that will work well. I think we're pretty focused on trying to understand how to get the experience right in VR, and I think that the user experience design is going to be quite different in those two mediums.
There'll be a lot of distinctions between those two things.
I think so. I think if we abstract up for a second VR and AR, I think our theory is that they're sort of going to diverge before they ever converge, if they ever do, because you're going to want to design what's a great experience, and to do that, you're going to focus on the use cases that are particularly good in those, and I think the use cases right now and for the near term are actually quite disparate.
All right, thank you so much. That was great.